As you know, they are very complex, and some parts of the due diligence system, it's quite easy when you, for example, draft a policy where you say what standards have to be met. That's quite easy. So we have guidance from the OECD there, you know, very serious human rights abuses, taxation, bribery, military forces, rebel groups, private and public security forces. What you can expect on each of those issues, it's already quite clear in the OECD guidance. But then remember, all these stages of the due diligence process, they are quite different, and you start to get standards for each of them. For example, the step number 4 on audit, there are standards for how to conduct an audit, and they are very detailed. Step number 5 on reporting, what should the report contain? That's also being standardized right now. And all these things are done through collaborative processes, because there is no other way to actually come to the right type of standard. So everybody needs to be involved. So in terms of what makes them work, I think at the stage where we are right now, I mean, remember, this is the last, 7-8 years, basically. I think we are just putting the component in place, and then each of them is being detailed and developed as we speak. And for example, the OECD developed separate guidance for tin, tantalum, tungsten, and then a separate one for gold, because the supply chain is different. So there are different specific measures that need to be taken for different supply chains. So I don't think I can offer a very insightful response in terms of each of the very specific details of the due diligence process. But if you have observations and your own experience with these things, I mean, maybe we can reframe what doesn't work, because maybe that's a bit easier to answer than what exactly works. Philip? Theo, if you want to add anything on the due diligence things, please chip in.
No, I of course agree. It's a very topic that you could, I mean, the length that you can have a presentation in itself on what is an effective due diligence program. But I think what you mentioned in your presentation earlier, that one broken link breaks the entire chain, is extremely important in having these effective due diligence procedures. And that's why the OECD guideline is such a good framework, because it involves the entire chain. If we just stop at the retailers and say that they need to have good policies in place, that won't change anything. You need to involve the smelters, the mines, the traders, and only if all of these actors have the right processes, only then will any improvements happen. I can also comment just on the issue with, I totally agree with the comment on South Africa. The picture from that mine was from a multinational company, and it's basically 3 multinational companies in South Africa that have the entire platinum production. So it's completely different from the DRC, but still very challenging from another perspective. And if we in any point could hope for better conditions in these countries, absolutely. I mean, we already see that, as Radu also mentioned, that due to new regulation and new requirements on multinational companies, things have actually changed in the DRC. Now they have their own regulation, which of course is flawed, and due to corruption is maybe not working as well as we were hoping for. But just 6 to 5 years ago, there was nothing. And we see, for example, child labor is not as prevalent in the mining of these minerals, where there is more regulation if you compare it to cobalt, for example. So it's unfortunately a very slow process, but through regulation and international requirements, and we've also seen this in other industries, change actually does happen. I just think that it's important not to kind of settle and say, I understand that that was not the point with saying that this was the case in Sweden and Australia 100 years ago, but this is a reality. But we can't just settle saying that we had this problem as well. There was child labor in Sweden, so let's give them 100 years. We need to have this kind of regulation to actually improve, but I definitely think that we can.
Okay, I'll follow on from that, and I'll try and go straight to raise the point. It seemed like you were comparing the pros of one against the cons of the others. So to deal with that, yes, but no. And where I tried to make a difference is with the fundamental structure of the fossil fuel industry. Just take 2 steps back from that. I've just spent over a decade of my own life working with advanced biofuels. So trying to push new alternatives, it's very, very, very difficult for a number of reasons. And there are so few options for fueling vehicles. We have an extremely established system, which is now being opened up. So fossil fuel lock-in, for me, I grew up, I didn't say when I presented it, I grew up, my father ran a coal mine. And we thought power stations were great because they and cement kilns were the major customers. There was no discussion of carbon dioxide as a threat against the climate. The discussions I have with my father are still quite interesting because he's been tied to the mineral sector for so long. But what is opening up with batteries and renewable energy systems breaks that system up to some extent. So I find that extremely important. But then we get to the situation where we have dirty, homogeneous mineral products. They're hard to separate from each other, and they have problematical supply chains. Even the best, so-called best mining companies, and you took a BHP Billiton, they have skeletons in their closet. Anglo American has skeletons in their closets. Rio Tinto, where I used to work, has skeletons in their closet. There's a lot to be done. We have this massive impetus to extract more and more types of minerals, and there's always a fraction of that, or even a large chunk, that will come from artisanal mines somewhere in the world. They're a small proportion of global production. They're a huge proportion of the number of people actually working in this dangerous, dirty industry. So are we locking us? I would rephrase it to, are we locking ourselves into more and more artisanal mining situations? And I have to back off an answer to that just to try and answer another question that was posed. Is there a future with humane mining? As someone else made that comment or passed that question. And the mining industry has been getting better. And the bigger the mining companies are and the more they have a public profile and a reputation, generally the better their performance. And so they are more humane and they follow the rule of law. What causes humane mining, or what drives that? It's not the mining companies. It's not their status in the world. It's the status of the governments regulating the mining sectors. And so each country that climbs further and further up the development ladder and gets more functioning rule of law and governance structures, then you'll have a more humane mining industry. I haven't been involved for a long time, but Chile is an example. You can go to parts of Chile and you'll find artisanal mining. You'll find very poor people working in extremely dangerous conditions. You'll also find that the majority of the country's production is run in the way, roughly the way a Swedish mine would be run. So I've been talking around and around the topic. I'm happy to say I'd rather have the version of mineral lock-in that I talk about, because there's not going to be a king mineral or a king metal. It is problematical because if you look at a picture of our developmental states, we're using more and more of the periodic table. So it's becoming much more complex, but we're not locked into just one option as we were with, or two options as we were with oil and coal. And so hopefully that's a better situation. And because FDI lands in developing countries and mining is, if it's managed well, can be a pathway to development. I say can be if it's managed well. Then hopefully it moves other things forward as well. I think the renewable energy systems will make a bigger difference than new mines, to tell you the truth. And that's what I'm hoping for. So that was a long and circuitous answer. I hope I answered some of the themes.
we see a lot of batteries going into sodium ion, and there are also long-term storage of solar energy and wind energy for, in larger plants where you actually have a company called Saltex here in Sweden, which look very promising. And that means that you're actually using less of the lithium and cobalt resources that the world can give us. And therefore you can use, do better due diligence on the actual metals we're using for electric vehicles, which have higher density, energy density than the newer innovations actually have. So, and there's a lot of exciting stuff happening, especially in solid state batteries where you have glass polymers kind of, and these can actually have better properties than lithium ion and cobalt batteries, where you have charging times which look promising up to, as low as 7 minutes, which would improve the products even better than we have it today. So it's an exciting time.
I can toss in that I'm neither a chemist or a metallurgist, so a lot of the things I read, I honestly don't really understand. But I'm reading something about batteries at least once a week that's presenting yet another test of a new battery formulation has functioned well. And so my guess is that we're going to have things like cobalt being replaced by nickel, because if I understand correctly, the cobalt atoms in the structure, they give stability. And scientists at MIT have been working with putting in cheaper, more abundant metals there, which has been difficult, but they've cracked one of the codes. So they're saying in 5 or 10 years these could be on the market. But we're hearing about glass polymer items being on the market sooner. I read another MIT or US based article just last week, which was saying, well, sodium cell batteries are 50-year-old technology, but they haven't been abundant because they're fragile. So the university researchers have been working with the wafer between the two halves of the batteries to make it robust. And instead of being based on ceramics, it's based on an iron compound, and it's working really well. And in 5 years' time, it could completely revolutionize the battery storage market. So what we're hearing is that it's an extremely fluid market, and that's partially because we haven't been very good at batteries for very long.
Yeah, I mean, this is just really the beginning of using batteries in, mobile phones for real. And I mean, the implementation in cars hasn't been done at scale for 5 years. And that's really where we're trying to be agile, where people have locked into a certain technology today, getting supplies for hundreds of thousands of cars, where we're trying to find newer technologies that can actually be sustainable for the next generation of EVs. And as said, it's just the beginning, really.
If we step back 10 or 15 years with artisanal mining, much of our focus was on saving artisanal miners from themselves and saving rainforests and rivers, because there are so many artisanal mining operations in tropical countries using mercury. So they were poisoning the community, they were poisoning the environment. And so lots of efforts have been made at clean gold or mercury-free gold. And of course, there was lots of instances where you had a conflict-related situation, or you had simple destruction, you had problems with a large company that was vested in rights, but the area was occupied by artisanal miners. So the World Bank and other organisations worked very hard. And one of the things that a number of those sorts of initiatives were trying to do was to ensure that there was a premium that could be paid to artisanal miners. So you weren't putting artisanal miners out of business, but you were giving them enough of a premium so that they could change practices and engage in capacity building. So that's a very simple example. Artisanal related mining, you're getting the market to value something that's better. So then let's shift to the larger operations, because we've had a number of studies, and I've been involved in work where we've said, look, if we could DNA print metal from specific operations, then, and certain certified operations could be shown to be greener, then it would have a market value. Now, you're going to have trouble selling commodities from large companies on the market at a price premium. But you can have preferential purchasing agreements. You know, it's a preferred supplier, and at forward rates, for example. So trackability and traceability can have a value to companies, both the producers and the buyers, because you're reducing risk. So those are a couple of examples. There's other examples of how there can be value for organisations that perform well, or supply chains that perform well. Preferred access to mineral resources, for example, that you have qualifying companies. So when there's open bids for mineral resources, as there are in some countries, that only the best actors get to play. So there's a lot more under the cover of that. So let's then go to the situation of where I've said larger companies with a reputation generally often perform better. Do you want to talk something again? Yeah. And that was just to take up, well, I did work for a large mining company and have seen how you can find things that you didn't know about that are legacies of the past. And also have seen how regulatory changes can radically change the way a company looks at its risk profile and does more work. And so I worked for Rio Tinto, which was then the world's largest mining company, and we considered ourselves to be pretty good. But then we had problematical situations in our history, and we also had problematical situations with ownership, because that company, I honestly don't know whether they've sold it yet. They had an 11% stake in the Grasberg mine in Indonesia, which is an environmental crime against the planet. They're not running it, but there was a partial ownership situation. So under the surface, there can be stuff that's beyond our control. But I do know that a very large organisation that I worked for was really diligent and was also really set on learning from its mistakes in the past. And I know several other operations that have done that. You took up the oil companies, though, and then I look at something like a company like BP, British Petroleum, and I'll take them forward as an example because the Alaska pipeline accidents, where that was institutionalized underinvestment in safety. That was criminal negligence. When you look at the Deep Horizon event, they had, if I understand the situation correctly, that company had shifted responsibility down to subcontractors, and the Norwegians said, well, for a hole in the ground like that, we would have had 20 safety stops. They had 3. So that's an institutionalized underinvestment in safety. So that's bad practice from a very large global company. So I buy what you're saying, that there can be a lot under the surface, company by company. But I have also seen on the ground where you have large companies with reputations to expect and the desire to be on institutional investment bodies. So, for example, I took up the Grasberg mine as an example. That's why Rio Tinto was not a stock held by the Norwegian pension fund. If they've divested, they probably are, because Rio Tinto is now divested from coal. So things do happen. I'm not saying that company's clean all the way through, but I would much rather work there than quite a number of other operations that I can pick out of the hat that have less clean. Yeah.
No, I can just add to that. I mean, I completely agree that there is a large responsibility for these large companies, and I would say that maybe the challenges and the risks and the impacts are different from artisanal mining, because even if they don't have artisanal mining in their own operations, we've seen a lot of cases. I mean, some have been mentioned here, but more on, for example, related to land rights, pollution, indigenous people's rights. Cases in Papua New Guinea where local population have been raped by security guards, cases in Guatemala where people who have protested the mines have been killed by security guards of the mining companies. So it's far from that, of course, that the large mining companies are clean. And I think that the issue of accountability and access to justice is one of the key issues when we talk about business and human rights, what is lacking today, because the regime that we have today, if we go back to the question of what is good due diligence, for example, today that is up to the companies to decide. The companies decide, we have done our due diligence and this is what we present, and there is basically no way of actually holding them accountable. So now there is a lot of discussion within the UN, and there have been some court cases in Canada and in the UK and to some extent in the US against these large companies, and some of them have been convicted of human rights violations. So not just health and safety issues in their own operations, but impacts on local communities, for example. And I think if we are serious with these issues and actually expect companies to respect human rights, there need to be accountability mechanisms. And that doesn't mean that all companies are bad and all companies are trying to deceive everyone, but without accountability measures, it's not the rule of law, because the rule of law says that there needs to be laws and adjudication and control over how we act as citizens, but also as how companies act as citizens. And if it's just up to the companies to decide what is good and what is bad, and if they've taken their responsibility, not many companies will actually admit and compensate victims, and that is one of the largest problems, I would say, today when it comes to business and human rights, that there's no way of actually holding companies accountable.
We're really trying to be this new company that has no heritage of using, fossil fuels or internal combustion engines in any way or form. And that's the difficult part of being a startup in the electric vehicle space, because you're trying to solve one problem, which is, for example, that more people die of emissions in London than of breast cancer. And you're trying to solve that problem with a means of transportation, which is electric mobility. And then you have the other side of the problem, which meet together, where you have problems in the sourcing of the products and problems of the usage of the products. And we're really trying to be agile, because we think that there will be a market for extremely clean electric vehicles. When you have markets that are bigger for, BMW i3, that they can produce millions of cars. And we have to find a differentiation where we can actually make a product that we can try to make sure it's clean in every aspect. And I think there is a market, and people do want that kind of product. And that's what we see when we design the product, which is not extremely conventional. It's not a 5-seat car, it's a smaller vehicle, and we're trying to use new technology. So our belief is really that I think there can be a market shift, and if just look at this room today. People are aware of the problem and want to solve it, I think.
Perhaps if I can just throw in, how many people have bought a head torch or a bicycle torch from Amazon and it's come in a packet from China? I have. Because I wasn't thinking. That's definitely lithium-ion batteries, and it's definitely from Chinese factories. Now, if I made a purchasing decision to reward a German manufacturer or a Swedish manufacturer, or actually Hope Lights from the UK, they make their own batteries, I believe. If I paid more and bought from a responsible producer, I would be rewarding them, even if their profit margins aren't more. The point is that it's a decision that we make, and we make decisions all the time in a knowledge vacuum, because we haven't been to this session and be made to think about, okay, if I've got a battery in it and I order it from China, there's a very good chance it's got cobalt. There's a much higher chance it's got cobalt from the DRC than if I buy it from a UK manufacturer. But I also need to weigh up the fact that it's 20% of cobalt that comes from artisanal miners that are probably in this bad situation, and maybe that doesn't help the situation on the ground. But if you want a guilt-free battery, you've made a purchasing decision. I think that would be a good purchasing decision to make, because we're buying so much from basically poorly controlled systems, because we can just make stuff and sell it without any responsibility for our supply chains. And lots of companies have been forced to look at their supply chains. The apparel industry, Nike and others have been forced to look back along textile and manufacturing chains for sporting clothes and the rest of it. And tangible improvements can be made. Do they get paid more for their stuff? Maybe not. Do they get an improved license to operate in society and retain brand image? That's valuing supply chain management on the market. H&M is a Swedish company that's working very much with brand management through supply chain management. I don't know so much about what goes on in that process, but that's an example. And it's a shame we don't have some of the students here. We had students with an investment advisory company. They were looking into a company that helps inform investors of where they should and shouldn't invest if they want a clean portfolio. And they'll even go to companies that are to be invested in by pension funds and the rest, and inform them of the weaknesses in their supply chain. And so getting that service, they can be rewarded for improving their projects by being on an eligible list for investment. So there's many ways these mechanisms can take place, but things do happen in reality.
Just to, sorry, I'm just quick on these with investors. I mean, it's a very important function that these providers provide, and we've seen more and more of this. But again, going back to my issue with accountability and actual legal frameworks that require companies to do it, a challenge with this with these providers is, for example, that in order for them to have a red list of companies saying that these companies are violating human rights, there needs to be a court case saying that they are violating human rights. Otherwise, it's just an unconfirmed case. So because we don't have any legal frameworks, and because it's very difficult to have these court cases, many of these companies still slip through. So it's a very good system that we have these kind of screenings, but there needs to be improvement with kind of the framework behind that in order to make them more credible. Question.
I think there's going to be, you can see a lot of battery production has been outside the EU today. And now that Northvolt is starting in Sweden and there's different initiatives in the EU, I think we will see more sustainable battery production, if that's the specific thing we're looking at. But I mean, the market has started valuing transparency in supply chain and, the product sustainability and its life cycle and where it goes after its life cycle. And we're getting better at afterlife, recycling and things like that. So I think it's something that the next generation and the generation to come will value immensely. And it will be a differentiator that will change people from choosing one product than the other. And, making it easier for consumers to see that as well, I think that will make it a massive change, really.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that a challenge for consumers today is that there is the lack of transparency in information. I mean, if whoever here goes to a store and wants to buy a phone, you don't know where that phone is manufactured, where the minerals are from, is it certified or not. You don't have that information, and the store doesn't have that information. So of course, by asking these questions as consumers, we can push companies to actually start to provide this kind of information. Another driver, as another big consumer, is the public sector. And more, at least in Sweden and in other Nordic countries, issues of the conflict minerals are included in requirements in public procurement. So for some companies, the public sector, when they sell, for example, electronics, that's their largest consumer, the largest customer. So if they say, we want you to adhere to the OECD guidance, for example, then you have to do it, because otherwise you lose 60% of your business, for example. So I think that public procurement is also going to be a strong driver. And in general, in the IT industry today, the companies are talking about their customers, even, I mean, other companies, they want to have this kind of information on product level. They want to know exactly what's in each laptop, where it comes from, each stage of the supply chain. And today, companies can't provide that information, but by consumers and big companies asking this, they know that this is something that they have to provide within, say, 5 to 10 years. Otherwise, they won't be competitive. So I think there are different, also investors, of course, saying that this is a financial risk, because if they invest in a company and suddenly there's an issue of child labor, for example, we've seen a lot of cases here in Sweden with companies that have lost their CEO, their board, they have been divested, their stocks have gone down. So it's a financial risk as an issue as well.
I mean, just in Sweden, we can see SEB's green bond initiative, where they've actually created a bond where they're just including green companies, I mean, through quite harsh due diligence. So, you know, and that's the big money. And then on the consumer level, that's going to change as well. But, you know, starting at big financial institutions really making that change, I think that will start to tilt the market into people actually demanding it.
You know, it's an interesting question, because the whole issue of conflict minerals didn't evolve because of consumer pressure. You didn't have those boycotts, that consumer awareness, like you had with diamonds, for example, blood diamonds, or with sweatshop industry, where child labor and sweatshop situations were a huge issue in universities, and there were boycotts and so on. Or in oil and gas, if you remember Shell in the mid-90s, there were boycotts all over the place. The Dodd-Frank Act, the American law that started so much of these developments, didn't come from a consumer outcry. And when companies started to issue the reports in 2014, 2015, nobody really bothered to read them or to report in the newspapers about it. So therefore, people who studied the effects of the law said that it didn't work in this name and shame mode. It didn't actually empower consumers or even investors to be able to separate the good companies from the bad companies. It was just very dull information, very homogeneous, that didn't enable consumer choice. So it's kind of an interesting situation that, you know, the whole issue is so explosive that so many actors are interested in it, but it's not fueled by consumer demand, actually. So in this situation, maybe consumer demand will come on later on. Because I think in the newspapers, if you know the details of what's happening in conflict zones or in artisanal mining, if they come up in the press, it's a damning story. It's very, very serious. It's forced labor, it's child labor, and so many atrocities there. So it's interesting.
Perhaps just to go into there and step away from the mineral sector, how many people remember the Greenpeace campaign against Dove soap, orangutans and palm oil in Indonesia? That's an example of NGOs doing their job, actually. Everything's black and white. Everything's either right or it's wrong. Were they completely truthful? Was everything completely realistic? No, but did they highlight real problems with native forests and natural resource management in the palm oil industry? Yes, they did. And they targeted a major multinational, the largest consumer of that particular resource. And that kicked off a process of seeking to certify supply chains for palm oil, which are problematical, just like the mineral chains will be very problematical. Just like the Forest Council chains are problematic. But NGO pressure really kicked off, and that's also one of the drivers that can create change. And what they were doing, they were taking a specific problem on the ground, but the solutions that were looked at were to focus on supply chain of custody, and trackability and traceability and certification to try to ensure that much more of the stuff getting onto the market was produced in a more responsible fashion, and that there was a mechanism to identify the businesses and the companies that were doing, if I can say that, the right thing or a better thing.
I mean, it's a good example, actually. NGO pressure in the case of conflict minerals, it has been a huge driver. And actually, many academics and people who looked at the conflict in Congo said that the whole NGO campaign is saying conflict minerals fuels or causes the conflict. They say this narrative is oversimplifying what's happening in the conflict in Congo. And many people pushed back against this narrative. Let's pass this American law, take the conflict minerals out of the equation, and the conflict will solve itself, more or less. People reacted very, very, very strongly against this narrative. But at the end of the day, I think after 10 years almost, it's I think nobody disputes that you need this type of regulation in order to deal with this issue. And, you know, don't forget about the bigger context of the conflict, because many other interventions are needed to solve the conflict. You need diplomacy, you need development assistance, you need many more things, not just cut the trade of minerals. I think we have time for one more short question or comment. So anybody who wants to be the last? No? Okay. We are good to go on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.